Today, I'm going to tell you a story so raw and intimate, it will stay with you long after it ends, unfolding in the unforgiving American frontier under bruised skies and whispering pines. This is a land where power is bought with fear, and love is considered a weakness, until destiny intervenes. It all started with a moment of kindness, something small, almost invisible, that sparked a chain of events no one could stop. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The wind over Silver Creek did not drift or wander. It tore through the valley. It swept down from the northern mesas, hard and dry, carrying the smell of sage, dust, and old stone. A restless wind, one that rattled loose window panes, slipped through warped boards, and reminded every soul inside those timber houses just how small they were beneath the open sky. For Elen Rowe, that sound was familiar. It was the only voice that kept her company most nights. She lived on the far edge of town, in a narrow, weather-beaten cabin set apart from the others. At 24, the Silver Creek crowd believed they already knew her story. They called her a woman left behind, a quiet figure fading into the background of frontier life. They were wrong. Elen was not unwanted. She was careful. She worked as a seamstress, without question the finest in the valley. Her hands were slim, often marked by needle pricks, yet steady and unyielding. Day after day, she bent over coarse miners' denim and threadbare coats, repairing what hard labor destroyed. Sometimes she stitched lace meant for weddings she would never attend. She could mend nearly anything: frayed hems, torn sleeves, worn elbows, everything except the ache she carried inside. Her mother had left her the cabin and a fierce sense of self-reliance, along with a warning passed down like scripture. Trust was a gamble the frontier rarely paid back. So Elen learned to stand alone, watching life move past her porch rail without stepping into its current. Then there was Kesh. He did not belong to the town. He belonged to the foothills, to open country where the air cut sharp and the land answered only to those who respected it. An Apache horsebreaker of 27 winters, Kesh moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, alert, controlled, dangerous in the way wild things often are. He did not come to Silver Creek for whiskey or conversation. He came for the livery. Leading bands of Mustangs pulled from canyon shadows, he drew stares wherever he went. Fear, curiosity, and something close to awe followed him through the street. He was striking, undeniably so, but it was not a gentle beauty. It was the kind that warned of storms and rising rivers. Kesh spoke fluently to animals and sparingly to men, silent, precise, alone. A man who watched the horizon and kept his back guarded. What passed between him and Elen did not begin with words, but with witnessing. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot enough to harden the mud of the main street into cracked clay. Elen stood on her porch, resting her eyes after wrestling with a stubborn seam, when raised voices carried from the livery corral. A new stallion had arrived, black as pitch, eyes rolling with panic. The Dry Creek wranglers circled it with ropes and shouting, trying to force submission from a terrified, magnificent animal. The horse reared, hooves flashing, defiance screaming from its throat. Then Kesh stepped inside the corral. From her porch, Elen held her breath. The stallion's coat was black as burned coal, his eyes flashing white with terror. Two men from the Dry Creek wranglers were trying to break him. They yelled over one another. Whips snapped through the air. Ropes flew and cinched tight, only making the animal more frantic, more desperate to escape. The horse rose up, iron-shod hooves striking empty air, a raw scream tearing from his chest as he fought for his life. Then Kesh stepped into the corral. From her porch, Elen Rowe felt her breath catch. She braced herself for violence. That was how the frontier worked. You bent the wild by force or it broke you first. But Kesh never lifted a whip. He never raised his voice. He walked forward, steady and unhurried, as if the chaos were flowing around him instead of at him. His movements were smooth, deliberate, like water slipping past stone. He stopped several feet from the stallion. The horse snorted, trembling hard, sweat foaming along his neck. Kesh stood motionless. He tipped his head just enough to soften his presence, refusing the challenge. Then he raised one hand, palm open, and began to speak. Elen could not make out the words, but she saw what they did. The sound was low and even, a measured rhythm that sank beneath the wind itself. Slowly, almost impossibly, the stallion stopped fighting. His ears twitched forward. Kesh took one careful step, then another, until at last his hand rested against the horse's dark, slick neck. He did not pull. He did not strike. He simply remained there, breathing with the animal, offering calm where fear had ruled moments before. From the shadow beneath her eaves, Elen felt something inside her falter. She saw past the knife at his belt, past the hard lines of his jaw. Beneath the danger was something deeper, a quiet, aching gentleness, strength held in restraint. For the first time in years, Elen wondered what it might be like to be touched by hands that could still a storm without violence. She did not yet know it, but the wind had shifted. The story had begun. For weeks after, what passed between Elen and Kesh was little more than distance shared in silence. A look from her porch, a nod from a moving saddle. It was fragile, built on curiosity and the quiet recognition of one lonely soul noticing another. But the frontier had no patience for fragile things. It asked for blood. And on a late August Tuesday, when heat shimmered off the canyon floor, blood answered. It happened near the crooked bend of the dry wash, only a few hundred yards from Elen's land. Kesh had been working a new colt. The colt was a roan, hot-blooded and reckless, all wildfire and bone-cracking kicks. Elen Rowe did not witness the moment it went wrong. She heard it, the shrill, panicked scream of a horse, followed by the heavy, sickening sound of a body striking packed earth. She was in her garden, fingers buried in sagebrush roots, when she looked up and saw him on the trail. Kesh was not riding the way he always did. There was no balance in him now, no easy command of the saddle. He sagged forward, his left arm hanging loose, useless against his side. The dun mare moved at a slow, careful walk, as if she understood her rider was damaged. As he drew closer, Elen saw the stain first, dark and spreading across the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. A hoof had caught him, not a direct hit, but close enough to tear flesh, close enough to crack bone. Any other man would have been shouting by then, spurring his horse toward town, calling for a doctor. Kesh did neither. His face was carved from stone, color drained to gray. Sweat beaded along his brow. His jaw was locked tight, clenched with the kind of pain that had nowhere to go. He meant to pass her gate without stopping. He meant to carry the injury back into the foothills, to lick his wounds alone like a hunted animal. As he rode by, he dipped his head in the barest acknowledgement, a shadow of a greeting. He intended to keep moving. Elen did not wave. She did not hesitate. She opened the gate and stepped straight into the mare's path. There was no smile in it, no softness. She moved with the same iron she used when she faced down the Silver Creek crowd and their whispers. She caught the mare's bridle and brought her to a halt. Kesh looked down at her, eyes unfocused with pain, blinking slow. He tugged weakly at the reins, trying to guide the horse around her. "I'm fine," he ground out. The words were shallow, scraped raw. Elen did not release the bridle. Her gaze moved from his ashen face to the blood soaking his sleeve, dripping into the dust at their feet. "You're lying," she said. "Kesh," she continued, her voice level, unyielding, "and you're being foolish. That's an artery or a deep vein. You won't make it to the ridge without bleeding out." She didn't wait for agreement. She turned the mare toward her cabin. "Get down." Whether it was blood loss or the shock of being ordered, Kesh obeyed. He slid from the saddle, boots hitting the ground unsteadily. His knees buckled. Elen was there at once, bracing his weight with her smaller frame, steering him past the front room and straight into her workroom. Light filled the space, clean, sharp. Solid tables. The scent of dried lavender cut through the bite of antiseptic. She set him on a wooden stool and moved with crisp precision. Elen was a seamstress. She knew how things were built, and she knew how to put them back together when they came apart. She took her shears and cut the buckskin away from his shoulder, peeling the fabric back to reveal the angry wound beneath. The wound was ugly, jagged and torn, where the colt's hoof had caught him. Elen Rowe did not flinch at the sight of exposed flesh. She tipped the bottle and poured whiskey straight into the gash. Kesh sucked in a sharp breath, a hiss cutting through his teeth, but he never pulled away. He stayed still while she worked. Then she threaded a needle, not the fine kind meant for lace. This one was thick and unforgiving, the sort she used on canvas and denim. The next 20 minutes became something quietly intense. There were no tender words, no comforting sounds, only the wind brushing the walls and the steady draw of thread through skin. Elen stood close enough that Kesh caught the clean scent of soap on her hands and sage clinging to her apron. Her movements were precise, unwavering, as she drew the torn edges together. Kesh watched her. The pain burned hot and blinding, yet his focus narrowed to her hands alone. He noticed the slight crease between her brows, the strength in her fingers as they held him steady. He was accustomed to fear in people's eyes, to suspicion. Not to this. She did not recoil from his blood. She did not hesitate over the old scars that mapped his skin. When she tied off the final stitch and cut the thread, her hands never trembled. She cleaned the wound again, then wrapped it tight in clean white linen. The room fell silent. Not empty. Heavy. Charged with a sudden awareness neither of them named. Kesh flexed his fingers, testing his arm. It held. He lifted his gaze to her, dark eyes searching her face like a man puzzling over something unfamiliar. "Why?" he asked. His voice was low, steady again. "Why help a drifter?" Elen wiped her hands on a cloth. She didn't meet his eyes at first. She studied the blood soaking the rag, then looked up. She didn't speak of charity or kindness. She said simply, "I don't like seeing good things wasted." The words lingered. She hadn't called him a man, or a neighbor. She had called him something worth saving. Kesh rose slowly, as if there were more he wanted to say. Thanks, perhaps, or a question about why she lived alone in a house built for more than one soul. But words had never been how he paid his debts. He dipped his head once, deep, respectful. Then he walked out. He mounted up and rode away without looking back. The distance between them, however, was no longer the same. Something had cracked. Elen told herself that was the end of it. 2 days later, she stepped onto her porch and found a small bundle resting on the railing. It wasn't meat or hides. It was a handful of rare blue columbine, flowers that grew only high in narrow rock seams, places reachable only by a rider like Kesh. A week later, she found a button carved from ironwood, polished smooth as glass, left in the same spot. Then a hawk's feather. The feather was bound in silver and brown. Kesh never came to the door. He never asked for thanks. Yet with each small offering left in the hush of early morning, the message grew clearer. He was settling a debt. Yes, but he was also doing something else. He was answering her. She had stitched him back together, and now, in his quiet, deliberate way, he was easing himself into the weave of her days. The slow burn had begun. Time moved differently on the frontier. It wasn't measured by clocks, but by the angle of sunlight and the turning of leaves. For Elen Rowe and Kesh, it became a rhythm, a steady pulse echoing through the canyons of Silver Creek. As summer's gold faded into autumn's sharp, biting chill, the space between them narrowed. Not with any sudden collapse of walls, but through doors easing open, one hinge at a time. Kesh never knocked. Parlors and pleasantries were not his way. Instead, his arrival announced itself with the blunt thud of an axe in the yard. He came down from the foothills as frost silvered the grass. Without a word, he shed his coat and went to her woodpile. Oak and cedar split under his hands in a cadence that held her gaze. Swing, crack, stack. Swing, crack, stack. He was laying in her winter, making sure that when the snow came heavy and deep, she would not be cold. It was a kind of devotion more intimate than any verse. Elen answered in the only language she knew. When Kesh finished and turned to leave, a bundle waited on the porch rail. Always the same, a round of sourdough, fresh from the oven, still warm, wrapped carefully in blue linen and rich with the smell of yeast and comfort. They spoke little during these exchanges. They didn't need to. The wood said, "I will keep the cold from you." The bread replied, "I will keep you strong in the wild." In those long, quiet months, they were alone together. A tether formed between seamstress and horseman, unseen by the Silver Creek crowd, yet strong as drawn wire. But peace is often only a breath held before the storm. The release came in November. The wind turned sharp, tearing the last yellow leaves from the cottonwoods. Elen stood in her kitchen, pressing a heavy iron over clean linen when she heard it. Not the familiar, even hoofbeats of Kesh's dun mare. The sound was heavier, the rattle of a wagon, the bright jingle of costly harness. She crossed to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see. Her heart stopped. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs, fluttering like a trapped bird. Rolling up the lane came a buckboard wagon, its boards painted black and worn smooth by distance. The man holding the reins was someone she hadn't seen in 5 years. His shoulders sagged. His hat sat low over his brow. But Elen Rowe knew him anyway. The angle of his jaw, the careless way he handled the lines. It was Thorne Rowe, her father. And he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a man who carried himself as if the land itself belonged to him. He wore a charcoal wool suit and a silk vest, topped with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his eyes in shadow. He sat rigid and still, studying Elen's cabin not like a visitor, but like a man taking measure. That was Calder Vaughan. The valley knew his name. He was the cattle baron buying up land piece by piece, turning open range into wire and warning signs. Elen didn't run. She didn't hide. She set the iron back on the stove, smoothed her apron, and walked to the door. She opened it as the wagon creaked to a stop. "Junebug," Thorne said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by cheap whiskey and too many nights at card tables in Tucson. He climbed down, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "You're looking thin," he said. "But, well?" Elen stayed in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I thought you were dead, Thorn. He flinched, not at the words, but at the truth in them. Now, he said, recovering, is that any way to greet your father? I came home, Elen, and I brought a friend. He gestured back to the wagon. Calder Vorn stepped down. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, solid as a stockyard gate. Silver rings flashed on his fingers in the cold light. He didn't smile. He looked at Elen the way a wolf sizes up a stray lamb, weighing effort against reward. Miss Rowe, Vorn said. His voice was deep, smooth, and utterly without warmth. Your father has told me quite a bit about your talents. My father tells plenty of stories, Elen replied. Her knuckles whitened against the doorframe. Most of them aren't true. Let us in, girl, Thorn snapped, the cheer draining from him. It's cold, and we've got business to discuss. Important business. Every instinct in her screamed no. Still, Elen stepped back. She wouldn't be accused of lacking hospitality, not even toward ghosts and predators. They sat at her small kitchen table. The room, usually filled with warmth and the smell of fresh bread, felt suddenly tight and airless. The kitchen suddenly felt tight and suffocating. Stale tobacco hung in the air, tangled with the sharp bite of expensive cologne. Thorn Rowe would not meet her gaze. He worried the brim of his hat between his fingers, hands trembling despite his effort to still them. Calder Vorn, however, watched her without blinking. I'll be brief, Miss Rowe, Vorn said, setting a folded document on the table. I'm a man who believes in growth. This valley is the future, and I intend to own that future. He tapped the paper with a thick finger. Your father, Vorn went on, is fond of wagers. Sadly, fortune is a fickle companion. He's accumulated a debt at my tables in the city, one he couldn't settle with cash. Ellen's eyes dropped to the document. She recognized the handwriting at the bottom at once. Thorn's signature. Beside it were the details of the property, the cabin, the garden, the creek access. You sold it, Elen whispered. The words knocked the breath from her chest. You sold my home. I didn't sell it, Thorn snapped, finally looking up. His voice was defensive, thin. I wagered it. I thought I had the hand, Elen. 3 kings. It was a sure thing. You gambled my mother's house, Elen said, her voice rising, shaking with a fury she had held down for 5 years. You left us. You left her to die alone, and now you come back to strip the roof from over my head. It's already settled, Vorn cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. The deed is mine. Legally, you're trespassing. He leaned forward, the chair creaking beneath his weight. Still, Vorn said, a cruel light flickering in his eyes. I'm not unreasonable. I require a housekeeper. My holdings are large, and capable help is scarce in this territory. Your father tells me you're handy with a needle, that you can cook, that you are obedient. The implication pressed down on the room, thick and choking. He didn't want a servant. He wanted possession. He wanted her under his roof, bound to his rules, collected like payment for her father's failures. You can work off the interest, Vorn said, smiling for the first time. It was a chilling thing to see. 10 years of service, and perhaps, we discuss returning the deed. Elen turned her eyes to Thorn. He stared at his boots. He knew exactly what had been done. Thorn Rowe understood exactly what Calder Vorn was demanding, and he had already agreed. He had bartered away his daughter's dignity to spare himself. Something inside Elen Rowe went still and hard. It wasn't a fracture. It was a setting. The fear drained out of her, replaced by the cold, clean anger she remembered from her mother. She pushed to her feet, planted her palms on the table, and leaned toward the cattle baron. Get out, she said. Vorn blinked, mildly entertained. Pardon me? Get out of my house, Elen repeated. She turned on her father. And you, take your debts and your lies and get off my land. It isn't your land anymore, Thorn shouted, rising, his face flushing red. Don't you understand? I'm trying to save you, you stupid girl. You're a spinster with nothing. Mr. Vorn is offering you a place, a future. He's offering me a cage, Elen fired back. This house is my mother's blood, Thorn. It is not your poker chip. I'd rather burn it to the ground than see it in his hands, and I'd rather die than serve a man like him. The silence that followed was complete. Then it broke. Fast and violent. Thorn lashed out, the reflex of a weak man cornered. His arms swung wide. The blow caught Elen square across the cheek. Crack. The sound was sharper than a gunshot in the small room. She staggered, caught herself against the stove. Her hand flew to her face as heat flared, and the taste of copper flooded her mouth. Thorn stood there, breathing hard, his hand still raised and trembling. Horror flickered across his face, but the damage was done. Vorn hadn't moved. He watched with detached interest. Then he rose slowly, straightening his cuffs. I see you need time to consider the reality of your position, he said evenly. He lifted his hat. I'll give you 24 hours, Miss Rowe. Tomorrow at sundown, I'll return. His voice never wavered. You'll have your bags packed, or my men will remove you, and they are not known for their gentleness. He went to the door, passing Thorn without a glance. Come, Thorn. Let the girl ice her face. She'll need to look presentable for her new position. Thorn paused, looked back at Elen. His mouth opened, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to plead. Elen turned away. She faced the wall and did not look back. Her hand stayed pressed to the bruise already blooming along her cheek. She heard the door shut. She heard the wagon groan as it rolled away. And then, for the first time in her life, the silence inside the cabin did not feel gentle. It felt like a grave. Elen Rowe stood alone, truly alone. The past she thought buried had clawed its way back to her door. Outside, the sun slid behind the western ridge, but it brought no warmth to Silver Creek. Dusk was usually her hour. Lavender shadows, the first chirr of crickets, a soft easing of the day. Tonight, the sky looked wounded, dark purple spreading like a bruise across the horizon, matching the mark deepening on her skin. Calder Vorn had gone, but his presence lingered like a sour stench that refused to lift. He had left 2 men behind, hard-eyed hired hands with their gun belts slung low. They weren't there to guard the place. They were there to make sure nothing walked away. Rook and Bell perched on her porch rail, rolling tobacco between their fingers, smoke drifting lazily into the air. Their laughter seeped through the thin walls. Elen sat in her dark kitchen, a cold cloth pressed to her face, listening. They sounded like carrion birds waiting for something wounded to stop breathing. 24 hours. That was the mercy men like Vorn allowed. One slow turn of the earth to decide whether she would become a servant in a stranger's house, or be cast into winter with nothing but the clothes on her back. Inside, the cabin had gone cold. The fire had burned itself down to ash. Elen didn't rise to stir it. She felt rooted in place, caught between the ghosts she carried and the monsters standing guard outside. Then the wind shifted. The horses in the paddock stilled. Crickets fell silent. Even the men on the porch stopped laughing. The air tightened, sharp, electric, the kind of stillness that comes just before lightning splits the sky. Kesh did not come by the main road. He didn't ride the dun mare to the gate. He emerged from the tree line at the edge of the yard, moving on foot, soundless as drifting smoke. He had felt it miles away, a tremor in the ground, a wrong note carried on the wind. The eagle eye didn't just notice what stood before it. It sensed what was missing, and what was missing was the valley's peace. Kesh stepped into the clearing, dusk glinting off the silver conchos at his belt. The men straightened, hands hovering near their guns. They were used to bullying farmers and debtors. They weren't used to facing something that looked carved from rock and shadow. Kesh didn't acknowledge them. He walked straight past the porch steps, boots silent on the hard-packed earth. "Hey," one of the men barked, stepping forward. "Nobody goes in there. Boss's orders." Kesh stopped. Slowly, he turned his head. He pinned the man with a stare so empty of mercy, so cold and stripped of humanity, that the guard took a step back without meaning to. Kesh said nothing. He held the look until the man dropped his eyes, swallowing hard. Then Kesh turned away and opened the door. He found Elen Rowe in the kitchen. She looked up when he entered. She didn't cry out. She didn't break. She only met his gaze with eyes worn thin and hollow. And in the dim light, Kesh saw it, the bruise blooming across her cheek, a clear mark of violence, a handprint, her father's hand. Backed by Calder Vaughan's greed, the room seemed to lose its warmth all at once. Kesh went utterly still. It was a frightening stillness. His breath stalled. His hands, hanging at his sides, clenched into fists so tight the leather of his gloves creaked. This wasn't the wild anger of a saloon fight. This was older, deeper, the buried fury of the earth itself, the pressure before a mountainside gives way. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and dropped to one knee beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers. His hand lifted, hovering near her cheek, trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of restraint. He brushed the edge of the bruise with his thumb. The touch was feather light, a stark contrast to the violence that had left it there. "Who?" he asked. The word was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of judgment. "It doesn't matter," Elen said, her voice fractured. "It's done. They want the house." She swallowed. "Kesh, they want me." He searched her eyes. The fear was there, yes, but so was exhaustion. She had been fighting alone for 5 long years. She was tired of holding the sky up by herself. Kesh did not command her. He did not tell her to hide. He did not try to decide her fate for her. Instead, he gave her the one thing no one ever had: a choice. "Elen," he said, his voice steady and grounding, like an anchor biting into the sea. "What do you want to do?" She looked around the cabin, the scrubbed walls, the curtains she had sewn, the life she had stitched together from scraps. Then her eyes moved to the door, where cigarette smoke from the guards curled inside. Finally, she looked back at Kesh, at the strength in his shoulders, the wildness in his eyes that he held in check only for her. "I want to leave," she whispered. "I don't want to fight for a house full of ghosts. I want a life where I don't fear the dark." Kesh nodded. He rose and held out his hand. "Then pack." His voice was final. "We ride tonight." The decision took a heartbeat. It changed everything. Elen Rowe rose to her feet. She didn't gather clothes. She didn't reach for her sewing machine. Instead, she crossed to the mantel where a heavy iron box waited. She opened it and removed a single sheet of paper. The deed. The thin scrap Calder Vaughan claimed gave him the right to own her life. Elen went to the hearth and struck a match. The flare lit her face in sharp gold, and for a heartbeat she looked nothing like a victim. She looked like judgment. She touched the flame to the corner of the paper. Together they watched the ink curl and blister, the signatures of her father, and the bank shriveling into black ash. It was a burial for her past, and she was the one who lit the fire. "Let's go," she said, letting the ashes fall into the hearth. They stepped onto the porch. Rook and Bell were waiting. Their courage had returned, fed by gun belts and the belief that numbers kept men safe. "Now where do you think you're going, Missy?" the taller one sneered, blocking the path. "Mr. Vorn said you stay put." Kesh moved in front of Elen. He didn't reach for the knife at his belt. He didn't draw a gun. His hand went to his hip, to the coiled bullwhip, a tool of his trade, meant for air and herds. "She goes where she wants," Kesh said. "Not tonight, she don't," the guard shot back, his hand dropping to his pistol. He never cleared leather. Kesh's arm moved faster than sight. A thunder crack split the yard, sharp, deafening. The whip uncoiled like a striking viper. It didn't lash the man's face. Kesh wasn't cruel. The leather wrapped tight around the guard's wrist. With one hard pull, Kesh yanked him off his feet. The man flew forward, hitting the dirt face first, his pistol skittering into the dark. The second guard panicked. He fumbled for his weapon. Too slow. Kesh was already there. A blur of motion. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, blasting the air from his lungs. The guard folded against the porch rail, gasping, the fight gone clean out of him. It was finished in seconds. Clean. Final. Kesh didn't strike them while they lay there. He didn't have to. He stood over them, the whip loose in his hand, a figure carved from verdict and shadow. "Tell Vorn," he said, his voice carrying toward the trees. "The debt is cancelled." He turned to Elen. He didn't wait for her to walk to the horses. He reached out and lifted her, hands firm and certain at her waist. For a moment, the world held its breath. Her feet left the ground, and for a breath she was weightless, suspended in his grasp. The contact sent a jolt through her, a sudden surge of warmth and safety that sank straight into her bones. Kesh set her gently onto the dun mare's saddle, her skirts lifting and settling around her. He swung up behind her, bareback, close enough that there was no space between them. He reached around her for the reins, his arms bracketing her on both sides, a living barrier. His chest pressed firm and warm against her back. "Hold on," he murmured into her hair. He whistled, sharp and cutting. From the dark, his second horse, a paint gelding, stepped out to follow. Kesh urged the mare forward into a gallop. They didn't look back at the cabin. They didn't look back at the guards groaning in the dirt. They passed the gate, left the town line behind, and turned toward the mountains. The wind tore at them, cold and biting. Yet for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty to Elen Rowe. It felt like release. The shadow on her doorstep was gone. They were riding into the wild, together, leaving the life you know is a kind of death. But it is also the only way to be born again. As they climbed higher, the valley of Silver Creek faded into a smear of gray against the horizon. They were moving into the spine of the continent, where the air thinned and the silence pressed heavy against the ears. The trail was cruel, a ragged slash of rock and shale winding up past the timberline. The horses lowered their heads, sensing urgency in Kesh's hands. Their breath burst into the night in white plumes, ghost-like in the freezing air. For hours, adrenaline held the cold at bay. But when the moon rose, pale and unblinking, the temperature dropped hard. This was high desert winter. A cold that didn't skim the skin but hunted bone and marrow. A cold that killed those who misjudged it. They rode until the horses could go no farther. Kesh found a shallow hollow beneath a granite overhang, a natural shield from the cutting wind. He slid down from the mare, boots crunching on frost-locked earth, and reached up to help Elen. When her feet touched ground, her knees gave way. She was numb, shaking so violently her teeth rattled uncontrollably. Kesh caught her at once, holding her steady against his chest for a brief moment. Then he moved. Quick. practiced. He unsaddled the horses with efficient speed, knowing that in weather like this, standing still was the enemy. He built the fire low, ringed tight with stones, just enough flame to push back the dark without announcing their position to the valley below. Fuel was scarce at that elevation. The fire fought bravely, but it was no match for the cutting frost. Kesh unrolled his bedding near the embers. It was a single buffalo robe, thick, cured, heavy with the scent of smoke and hide. Only one. He had lived alone his entire life, and his gear told that story. No tent, no spare blankets, just the robe, the fire, and the merciless night. Elen Rowe stood close to the flames, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. She watched Kesh move among the horses, murmuring softly in Apache, checking hooves by feel in the dim light. Shame crept over her, colder than the wind. She stared at her hands made for needles and thread, for careful work done indoors, where walls held warmth. Out here, she felt useless, a weight, a stone dragging down a wolf meant to run free. Kesh returned to the fire and took her in at a glance, the blue at her lips, the violent tremors she couldn't stop. He didn't ask. He ordered. "Lie down," he said, voice low, leaving no room for argument. He gestured to the buffalo robe. Elen hesitated. "Kesh, I can't. I'll take the edge. You need your rest." "If you sleep on the edge, you freeze," he said, stepping closer. "And if you freeze, I have to carry you. Get under the robe." She obeyed, lowering herself onto the frozen ground and pulling the heavy fur over her shoulders. Moments later, the earth shifted beside her. Kesh lay down. At first, he didn't touch her. He rested on his back, staring up at the granite overhang, his body a steady furnace beside her chilled frame. But the cold was relentless. It stole the warmth from the space between them until there was no choice left. Kesh turned onto his side and drew her back against him, his arms settling around her waist, pulling her flush to his chest. It was instinct. Survival. The simple sharing of heat to keep death at bay. Yet as her shaking eased, replaced by the slow spread of his warmth into her frozen limbs, something shifted. The silence pressed in, magnifying everything. The faint crackle of dying embers. The wind screaming outside their shelter. The rhythm of two hearts beating far too close to ignore. "I'm sorry," Elen whispered into the dark. Her voice was small, thin. Kesh went still. "For what?" he asked. "For this," she said. "For being a weight on you," Elen Rowe whispered. "You could have been halfway to the border by now if you weren't dragging a seamstress up a mountain. I don't belong out here, Kesh. I'm a burden." He stayed silent for a long while. His hand, resting along her arm, shifted slightly. His thumb brushed the coarse wool of her coat. "You think you're the burden?" he asked quietly. His voice hummed through her back. "Elen, look at me." She turned within the circle of his arms and faced him in the dimness. His eyes were dark, catching the last flicker of firelight. Wild, dangerous, like a piece of the land itself, unforgiving and alive. "I've lived alone my whole life," Kesh said at last, choosing each word the way he chose footing on a rock slide. "I sleep in dirt. I smell like horses and blood. I have nothing to offer a woman like you but a fire and a fight." He looked toward the mouth of the shelter. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice lowering. "Afraid I was too wild for you, that just being near me would break you." He turned back to her, his gaze fierce and steady. "I've broken wild stallions. I've fought men who meant to kill me. I've ridden storms that tore trees out by the roots." His breath slowed. "I've never known peace. Not once." He lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, the same cheek bruised by her father's strike. His calloused palm was impossibly gentle, a reverence that stole her breath. "But you," he whispered, "you are the only thing that has ever quieted me." The words lingered, heavier than any vow. He wasn't offering protection. He was offering himself, the wolf laying down his head. Elen reached up and covered his hand with hers. The fear of pursuit, the shame of debt, the sting of the blow, all of it drained away. "Then don't break," she whispered. "Just hold me." And he did. The change was subtle, like a season turning. They were no longer just two people enduring the night. They were a man and a woman who understood that safety lived only within the circle of the other's arms. He drew her closer, not with desperation, but with a slow, certain claiming. The rough wool between them no longer mattered. The warmth beneath it did. The intimacy wasn't in skin, but in trust. His breath at her hairline, the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. While the wind howled outside, inside this small pocket of the world, they were whole. They fell asleep that way, entwined beneath a single buffalo robe. Snow began to fall in a soft, steady hush, burying their tracks and closing the door on the world they had fled. They had ridden into the wild as runaways. In the stillness of the mountains, they became something else. They became a home. There are places that never appear on any map, places where the wind eases into a whisper, where water runs clear and sweet, and where the world of men, with its debts and hungers, cannot reach. Kesh knew one. After days of pushing through snow-choked passes, they descended into a hidden cleft in the earth, a high-walled canyon known only to the Apache elders of his bloodline. As they slipped through its narrow mouth, concealed by twisted juniper, the air shifted. The sharp cold of the peaks softened, held at bay by stone. Elen Rowe pushed back her hood and lifted her gaze. It was an oasis. Green grass spread across the valley floor, fed by a spring that never froze. Cottonwoods lined the creek like quiet sentries, bare-limbed and waiting for spring. The place was wild, yes, but it welcomed them. Kesh reined in the horses. He said nothing. He only looked at her, his face worn but open. Waiting. Elen slid down from the saddle. She reached into the deep pocket of the coat she had fled in. Her fingers found something small and hard. Seeds, squash, beans, wildflowers, saved from her mother's garden, gathered without knowing why. She looked at the earth, then at Kesh. "We can build here," she said softly. And they did. Life slowed, falling into step with the seasons. They raised a cabin of felled cedar and river stone. Nothing grand, but solid. Kesh shaped the roof to bear the weight of snow. Elen packed the walls with clay and dry grass, sealing warmth inside. When spring arrived, splashing the canyon in purples and golds, Elen planted her seeds. She knelt in the soil, hands once meant for fine stitches now brown and strong under the sun. She coaxed life from the ground, the same way she had coaxed gentleness from Kesh. He returned to the only trade he knew. He built a rough corral and rode the high meadows for wild mustangs. But the work had changed. Once, he would have broken a stallion by force. Now Elen stood at the fence, watching, and Kesh listened. Elen Rowe taught Kesh that patience could be stronger than any whip. She walked into the corral with him, her presence steady, her calm grounding the air itself. Together they became a quiet legend, horseman and healer. Kesh gave the animals direction. Elen offered trust. Side by side they gentled wild spirits, shaping loyalty without ever breaking a heart. But peace is a jealous thing, and fear has a way of lingering. A year later, when the aspens shimmered gold in the breeze, a shadow crossed their refuge. Kesh was down by the creek, rinsing sweat from his face, when instinct locked him still. The eagle eye lifted. High on the ridge, cut against the blue sky, sat a rider, a man with a long gun sheathed at his saddle. A bounty hunter, perhaps, or just a drifter hunting a pass through the mountains. Kesh reached for his rifle, then stopped. Elen stepped beside him. She didn't shake this time. She slid her hand into his, fingers lacing tight. They stood motionless, breath held, watching. They were hidden by the life they had built, by trees and stone, by silence, by the sheer unlikelihood of their existence. The rider paused, looked down into the canyon. It felt as if he looked straight at them. But he saw only shadow and rock. He turned his horse and vanished over the ridgeline. Kesh released a long breath. He looked at Elen, and a slow smile found his face. In that moment they understood. The people they once were, the spinster seamstress and the Apache outcast, were gone. In their place stood ghosts, free, unclaimed, bound to this beautiful canyon. The world had forgotten them, and that was the greatest gift of all. 5 years later, the herd had grown strong. 20 horses grazed the meadow, coats gleaming like burnished copper in the sun near the paddock. A child sat astride an old, gentle mare. A little girl of 4, with hair dark as raven wings, and eyes holding the deep, thoughtful quiet of her father. Kesh walked beside the mare. The man once feared, once whispered about in towns, reached up with a hand scarred and calloused. He held no weapon, no whip. He gently adjusted his daughter's small fingers on the reins. "Soft hands, little bird," he murmured, his voice a low hum of love. "You don't pull. You ask." Elen watched from the cabin porch, a basket of vegetables resting on her hip. She saw the man who cherished her, and the child who would never know the terror of debt or the sting of a raised hand. Here they were safe. Here they were whole. She smiled, and the wind carried it through the canyon. Some say they vanished. Some swear they died in the winter snows. But the wind that threads those stone walls knows better. They did not flee from life. They ran toward it. In the quiet places beyond fences and ledgers, they found something no debt could ever claim. A love that healed as surely as it protected. A love that asked nothing and gave everything. Long after their tracks were buried, the canyon remembered them. The creek kept their laughter. The cottonwoods held their names. And the horses, grazing soft-footed in the meadow, learned patience from a man who once knew only storms, and trust from a woman who refused to be owned. If you listen when the light thins and the air goes still, you might hear it. The hush of hooves, the murmur of a voice teaching gentle hands, the steady rhythm of 2 hearts that chose each other. They did not disappear. They endured. And in the wild, they became whole. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you. Truly. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.